Why earlier congressional UFO hearings never happened. Considering that the U.S. Congress recently had its first genuine hearing on the subject of UFOs, now UAP, it might be interesting to reflect on why this was so. During the 1950s and 60s, there were several attempts to establish such a hearing as what we just saw, but all of those attempts failed. Why was that? The National Investigative Committee on Aerial Phenomena, that's NICAP, was a private organization that emerged in the late 1950s with the goal of ending UFO secrecy. It was led by retired Marine Corps Major Donald E. Kehoe. It boasted 3 admirals on its executive board. NICAP was a force to be reckoned with. Its most prominent member was Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter, former director of the CIA, who at least acknowledged the reality of UFOs, or at least in some form, and had agreed to testify before Congress about the secrecy surrounding the phenomenon. NICAP's first major push for open congressional hearings on UFOs came in the late 1950s, not long after the organization started. Despite the organization's strong connections and the support of several leading members of Congress, these initial attempts were met with disappointment. Each time it seemed that NICAP was on the verge of success, the initiative would fizzle out at the 11th hour. In 1961, it appeared that NICAP might finally achieve its goal. Plans were in place for Hillenkotter to appear before Congress in the spring of 1962 to discuss UFO secrecy, just an amazing development. However, in February of that year, Hillenkotter abruptly resigned from NICAP and withdrew from the UFO issue altogether. Shocking Kehoe came out of nowhere. Hillenkotter was almost certainly under pressure from, we'll say, unknown sources, but presumably his colleagues from within the intelligence community. Despite this setback, NICAP continued its fight. Through the 1960s, the organization challenged the Air Force's position on UFOs and continued to push for open congressional hearings. However, at the height of the UFO crisis in 1966, NICAP's efforts were once again thwarted. It did get to experience a minor victory in 1968 when it helped to promote a one-day UFO symposium, not quite a hearing, but a day in which several leading researchers got to speak to members of Congress, although no one from NICAP got to do that. The hearing, or the symposium, really, it was important for a number of reasons, but it really had little to no public impact. Then in the late 1960s, NICAP's leadership changed hands. Its longtime director, Kehoe, was ousted. The new director, John Acuff, a man with strong CIA connections, ended NICAP's criticism of government UFO policy, dismantled its investigative and reporting network, and that was basically all she wrote. So why did the NICAP initiatives for congressional UFO hearings continually meet with disappointment? Well, there's a few reasons that I've identified. I'm just going to list them here. So first, I've got political climate and institutional structures. I was originally going to separate them, but then I just grouped them together. Firstly, the political climate of the time was dominated by the Cold War, which created an environment of secrecy and suspicion. Not that we don't have such a climate today, but it was very much entrenched back then. UFOs were primarily and essentially viewed through the lens of national security. Of course, those with the highest levels of need to know, I think they understood fully that the phenomenon represented something truly anomalous and extraordinary, which under no circumstances they felt they could discuss. Still, various others in the government and military who were not read into the program were concerned for different things. They were concerned that to the extent UFOs were a legitimate phenomenon, that such sightings could be misinterpreted as Soviet activity, or worse, used by the Soviets as a cover for actual attacks. This was discussed more than once back then, a number of times. In all instances, these attitudes led to a strong reluctance to openly discuss the issue in Congress, either for fear of revealing sensitive information or even of causing public panic. And yes, public panic was a concern back then, at least to some extent, and seemingly to an extent greater than it is worried about today. Was such a worry truly justified? We're never going to know, but the memory of the 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcast, which had caused a fair amount of panic, We can argue, historians actually will sometimes minimize the panic, but I feel when I look at it, it was definite amount of panic that did happen. And it was due to the very realistic depiction of an alien invasion. And this was still very fresh in many people's minds. And I have very little doubt that some public officials were definitely interested in avoiding a repeat of anything like that. I think that was partially on their mind. But probably a bigger factor was that a discussion of UFOs in a public forum like Congress could risk revealing sensitive information. Although the U.S. government had a public program related to UFOs, that's Project Blue Book, it also clearly had a more serious, classified component to the phenomenon, as we now know for certain since the release of many documents via FOIA starting in the 1970s. It's entirely possible, I would even say likely, that a congressional hearing on UFOs would have exposed military encounters with UFOs that were similar to the shocking events that we now know were being documented and hidden from the public. There would have been no motivation for such information to come out, at least from the point of view of the military leadership. Furthermore, the Robertson Panel, which was a CIA-orchestrated scientific advisory panel on UFOs, which was convened not very long before, back only in 1953, and had recommended a policy of public education, as they called it, and debunking to reduce public interest in UFOs. That was still very much part of the picture. This policy had been largely adopted by the government and by the military, further reducing the likelihood of congressional hearings on the subject. And lastly, the political will for such hearings was just not there. While there were some scattered advocates, it was in 1966, there was Congressman Gerald Ford, who called for a congressional investigation into UFOs. They were the exception rather than the rule. Most political figures were skeptical, and all were terrified of the UFO phenomenon. They either saw it as a fringe issue, unworthy of serious attention, or were more likely concerned about the political fallout for supporting a hearing about it, or both. And the political climate was strongly influenced, I would say dominated really, by the institutional structures within the national security establishment that were utterly opposed to the release of any genuine information about UFOs. CIA, for example, never had a word to say about UFOs publicly back then, although years later it admitted it had a, quote, limited and peripheral attention to the phenomena. Of course, this was its public position. We know from FOIA that there was a definite interest by the CIA in UFOs, but it is hard to see how the agency would simply allow information about UFOs to be aired publicly in any meaningful way, especially since the Robertson Panel, which I just mentioned, which the CIA sponsored and organized, explicitly recommended a debunking approach to the subject just a couple of years earlier. Also, the U.S. Air Force, their Project Blue Book, which was tasked with investigating UFO sightings, was often criticized for its dismissive explanations of sightings, which admittedly had frequent credibility issues, would similarly find itself at risk of looking dishonest or incompetent if a genuine hearing on UFOs had occurred. Blue Book had been telling the public for years by this time that there was effectively nothing to see, keep moving along. How could it possibly desire to support a hearing that would completely contradict its position? And Blue Book was part of the DoD, the Pentagon. So the Pentagon would have zero motivation for making Project Blue Book look any worse than it already did. Now, among people not truly in the know on UFOs, but who were still influential, which were undoubtedly the vast majority of political figures, and even the majority of intelligence officials. I mean, they weren't all read into the program. Most of them were not. Among those people, there was simply a tremendous institutional bias against recognizing UFOs as a legitimate subject of inquiry. This, combined with the overarching national security concerns of the Cold War, this created a serious barrier to gaining the political support necessary for these hearings. So that's political climate, and institutional barriers. Next, we'll talk about NICAP and its problems. NICAP was a significant player in the fight for UFO transparency, let's call it that, during the late 1950s and in the 1960s. Now, as a private organization, it had a couple of things going for it. It was really well positioned in some ways to challenge the government's stance on UFOs. It didn't have huge bureaucratic red tape. It didn't have any political pressures that government agencies faced. It truly was an independently, or at least it attempted to act as a quick-acting independent organization. And it did a very good job, especially in those early years. And its leadership was composed of highly respected and influential figures. I mentioned Kehoe, retired Marine Corps major. I mentioned Hillenkotter, who had served as director of the CIA. And on top of this, its board of directors had a number of admirals and other respected military officers. NICAP was very well positioned to be the go-to private organization on this, and in many ways it really was. And Kehoe was tireless as an advocate for open congressional hearings on UFOs, so they had a lot going on in their favor. Even so, despite the dedication, despite the weight of their collective reputations, NICAP's attempts to gain open congressional hearings on UFOs were repeatedly thwarted. Each time they seemed to be on the brink of a breakthrough, at least if you read Kehoe's books on it, and each time they were met with disappointment. As mentioned earlier, one of the most significant events happened in 1961 when Hillenkotter, under what appeared to be major pressure, resigned from NICAP and withdrew altogether from UFOs. That was a major blow to NICAP. The man had been the director of CIA, and in fact, his involvement had lent the organization a significant degree of legitimacy. His departure undoubtedly weakened NICAP's standing. It seemed obvious, and it seemed every bit as obvious today, that he was subjected to some form of intimidation by his colleagues in the intelligence community. And frankly, intense pressures were regularly faced by those within the establishment who sought to challenge the status quo on UFOs. At around the same time, something of this sort seems to have happened to the former head of Project Blue Book, U.S. Air Force Captain Edward Ruppelt, who in 1960 issued a revised version of his classic book on UFOs called The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, where he essentially debunked his own first edition in the most puzzling and indeed, I would say, sophomoric manner. In other words, it wasn't enough for NICAP simply to advocate for UFO transparency or openness or simply to present the evidence and make a rational argument. No. NICAP had to navigate a complex and hostile political landscape. Now also, consider the strategy that Kehoe used simply to get Congress to listen to him. Because the UFO issue was so fringe and even taboo, he framed the need to investigate UFOs as a potential threat to national security. Sound familiar? Kehoe argued that these unidentified objects could be misinterpreted as Soviet missiles. This is a concern that was indeed shared within parts of the defense community. He was not the only one who discussed this. And this approach by Kehoe was designed to appeal to the anti-communist sentiments that were prevalent at the time and the focus on national security that was very dominant. But you could wonder if that strategy had its own limitations. I've wondered that if by tying the UFO issue so closely to national security, Kehoe may have inadvertently reinforced the perception that the subject was a matter of defense rather than a scientific or exploratory concern. I don't think this would have truly changed anything at the time, frankly, but it's possible. You could at least wonder that the whole national security threat approach, did that contribute to the reluctance of Congress to hold open hearings on what would undoubtedly be sensitive defense issues during a tense geopolitical era? Would not be a good look for them. Just a thought. Still, had Kehoe and NICAP tried to portray UFOs as more of a scientific or intellectual puzzle than as a potential national security threat, you have to ask yourself honestly, how much better would such a strategy have worked in the context of that era. I personally doubt the result would have been any different. It's just something to think about. So that's NICAP. They had a lot going against them, a lot of obstacles. Next, lack of physical evidence. Talking about why hearings did not happen or failed to happen. So you got the 2023 congressional hearing on UAP. Now, that did not present any actual pieces of a UFO either, but there was quite a lot of talk about physical artifacts and indeed of numerous actual craft currently, we'll say allegedly, possessed by the U.S. defense establishment or by private contractors. Moreover, in recent years, we have all heard about the so-called metamaterial, which at least is something that does exist and is argued to have come from a UFO. Now, there are many specific claims made by David Grush about this type of phenomenon, actual physical artifacts and much more, bodies, he talked about all of that, all of which were definitely shocking statements for Congress and the world. It would have been extremely difficult for NICAP or other private UFO advocates back in the 60s to have made similar claims, or even to have hinted at such things. Generally speaking, few, if any, members of NICAP believed such things themselves, certainly not publicly. Overall, it seems evident that knowledge, much less discussion of UFO crash retrievals and acquisitions, scarcely existed. A couple of exceptions. I'll just mention one here. There were a few artifacts floating around, or at least some discussion of them. To give one example, there was Wilbert Smith, the senior radio engineer with the Canadian Department of Transport, who figured into much of the history of UFOs during the 1950s. Smith was deeply involved in the study of UFOs. He had a particular interest in their potential technological implications. His interest in UFOs wasn't just a hobby. He led a Canadian government project known as Project Magnet to study them. So not long before he died in 1962, Smith stated in an interview with two private researchers that was published later, he said that he had held a piece of a flying saucer in his hands. He had been loaned it, he said, by none other than the United States Air Force. It's incredible. Exactly how this happened is unclear. The piece was allegedly shot from a small flying saucer near Washington, D.C. during the famous July 1952 UFO flap that happened there. Smith claimed to have been shown this piece, or he claimed to have shown this piece to his friend and fellow NICAP board member, Admiral H.B. Knowles. Smith emphasized that it was not the U.S. Air Force who determined UFO policy, but a, quote, small group very high up in the government. Now, unfortunately, the details about the artifact, like its physical characteristics or the circumstances under which it was loaned to Smith, are not clear from his statement. It's also unclear what, if any, analysis was performed on it. However, Smith did hint that the group that received the artifact back from him was extremely powerful, possibly the CIA or possibly even beyond the CIA. He was asked if he had returned the artifact to the Air Force, and he said, not the Air Force, much higher than that. And when further probed if it was the CIA, he chuckled. He said, I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I don't care to go beyond that point. I can say to you that it went into the hands of a highly classified group. You will have to solve that problem, their identity, for yourselves. He died not long after that. So I don't think there's any question that some circles knew about physical evidence of UFOs, but almost no one was talking. And certainly by the time Smith died in 1962, the artifact that he was talking about had to have been long out of circulation. I am willing to bet that Kehoe knew about this. After all, they were all board members of NICAP. They were friends. Although Kehoe never referred to this in anything that I've ever read. I would not be surprised if others close to Kehoe knew about other artifacts. However, no one mentioned a thing about this type of phenomenon, like recovered bits of a UFO, which, had they done so, you wonder if that could have possibly enabled the idea of congressional hearings on UFOs back then to have made more headway. The problem is that the notion of acquired artifacts overall seemed so incredibly outlandish to nearly everyone, certainly the public, and really to most researchers, that I think it was just a non-starter. You could argue that physical evidence, while helpful, might not have been essential for a successful hearing, and I would agree with that. Good testimony from credible witnesses can go a long way. Even so, I do think the recent hearing was helped by claims of physical evidence, even if such evidence was not explicitly identified. And I suspect, I can't know this yet, but maybe we'll find out, that the behind-the-scenes conversations about actual physical craft and evidence may have been a genuine spur to some of these members of Congress in holding these hearings. I would not be surprised at all. Another reason that I think hearings in the past failed, certainly after the late 1960s anyway, was the Condon Committee. That is the study of UFOs by the University of Colorado that was contracted by the U.S. Air Force from 1966 and then finally released its report in 1969. I think this was a significant factor as well on the failure to obtain congressional hearings on UFOs, at least after the 1960s. Very significant. The committee's mandate was to conduct an independent scientific study of the UFO phenomenon, and its conclusions were expected to have a profound impact on the public perception of UFOs and the government's handling of the issues. But the committee's work was marred from the outset by controversy. It was accused justly of bias. It was argued correctly that its members had already made up their minds about the non-existence of UFOs even before the investigation had begun. Particularly, this is true of the leadership, which continually showed a total lack of interest in UFO witnesses and in most of the compelling cases. Ultimately, none of that mattered. None of the criticisms mattered. Despite all the criticisms of bias, the lack of transparency, all of that, committee's report, released in 1969, stated that further study of UFOs was unlikely to yield significant scientific discoveries. This conclusion was widely accepted not just by the scientific community, but at least to some extent by the general public, which seriously dampened any new initiatives to get this before Congress. That was that. I mean, it ended Project Blue Book, which we all know about, but really the Condon Committee report seriously, I think, effectively put an end to the push for congressional hearings on UFOs for a long, long time. Any support that might have existed, I think, completely evaporated after that report came out. Ultimately, it must be considered that the Condon Committee was selected by the U.S. Air Force to do exactly the study because the Air Force felt confident they would get what they paid for. This was a very astute move by the national security establishment, frankly, to take full control over the UFO narrative at the time, and it worked beautifully. That narrative was slipping away from the military by the late 60s, and the Condon Committee put things right back in their court. So, to conclude, when looking at the past failure to achieve a congressional hearing on UFOs or UAP, I consider it a small miracle that such a thing actually happened in 2023. And you'll notice that in this analysis, I haven't tried to explain why the hearing actually did happen this year. Instead, I wanted to highlight some of the key factors that caused prior attempts at a hearing not to happen, to end in failure. We can return to the 2023 UAP hearing in the future. For now, I just think it's useful to appreciate the difficulties that prior generations of researchers and activists faced in their attempts to move this issue forward. I would say that ultimately Kehoe and NICAP faced an utterly implacable national security establishment. I don't think that establishment has changed all that much in its attitude over the years since then. What has changed, however, is enough of a societal transformation over the last several decades that a push from below, if we can call it that, was able to happen. I'm really talking about the internet, something that since the 1990s has revolutionized the exchange of information and has radically affected our culture in the process. For at least 15 years, I have believed that the internet age would eventually result in some kind of disruption to the system of control over UFO information. And I do think we're seeing some of the result of that. Of course, the other side retains many of its most effective weapons. Indeed, that side may well succeed in its efforts, as I see it, in re-establishing near total control over the public discussion of UFO or UAP. But we should not dismiss the gains made over the past few decades regarding UFO information and verified data of that phenomenon. We should not be surprised that at some point such gains have developed a power and momentum of their own. I suspect that another motivation for the recent hearing, which certainly would not have applied 60 plus years ago, is financial. And here I speak of corporate incentives to cash in on the UAP technology bonanza, assuming that some corporations in some circles are aware of this. I strongly suspect they are. Back in the 1960s, I don't think the situation was anywhere nearly as advanced in that matter as it is today. Essentially, the warriors of several generations ago had very little going for them and everything stacked against them. They most definitely fought the good fight, a true David and Goliath story, except in this case they didn't kill the giant. We may hope, however, that future efforts can do just that.